Welcome everyone today to the IRS virtual education session entitled Anesthesia Education in the Time of COVID. This session has been co-sponsored by the Society of Education and Anesthesia. This program has received no financial support. Please note the following information about CME accreditation, and know that the IRS and SEA members will receive an email following this webinar with information on how to claim CME credits. Also note that the abstract submission is now live for the 2022 IRS meeting in Hawaii. Please visit the meetings.irs.org for more information on this wonderful opportunity. Also note that following this webinar, you're able to continue the conversation around topics presented today in the IRS member community called Doc Matter. For those of you that may not be familiar, this community consisting of IRS members and other interested anesthesia researchers is a place to collaborate with your peers around clinical and research topics within your areas of interest in the field of anesthesia. So if you have any questions, please feel free to use this forum to get them answered. A recording of this webinar will be available to IRS members via irs.org after the session. Please use the Q&A button below to ask questions. I'll now introduce our panel. First, I'm your moderator, John Mitchell. I'm from Beth Deaconess Medical Center in Boston, Massachusetts, where I work as the Vice Chair for Education and the Director of our Center for Education Research entitled CERN. Our first speaker today, and I wanted to say I'm really pleased to introduce this panel of esteemed educators who are longtime friends and colleagues. First up is Dr. Susan Martinelli. Susie is a professor of anesthesiology and the residency program director at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Her career is centered on being a clinician educator with a focus on research and education. One of her research interests is in innovative approaches to graduate medical education, such as the flipped classroom. Additionally, she has developed programs that utilize family and friends to improve the well-being of healthcare providers, including medical students, residents, and attending physicians. She's received grant support from the AAMC, the AMA, and the Foundation for Anesthesia Education and Research for these efforts. She enjoys collaborating with other institutions on this work as well. Dr. Julie Huffmyer is our second speaker, and she's a tenured associate professor of anesthesiology in the Department of Anesthesiology at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Virginia. She completed her residency in anesthesiology at the University of Virginia in 2008 and a combined cardiac and anesthesia and liver transplant anesthesia fellowship in 2009. Dr. Huffmyer has served as the anesthesia residency program director since 2016 and was the associate program director for 5 years prior to that time. Her clinical work encompasses anesthesia care for patients undergoing cardiothoracic surgery and liver transplantation. Dr. Huffmyer has focused the first 10 years of her career on improving education of residents in anesthesiology through education research, focusing on generative retrieval practice and the impact of resident night float work on high fidelity simulated driving performance. She was recently awarded the FAIR ABA Research and Education Grant to examine the association of the maintenance of certification in anesthesia, or also known as the MOCA Minute questions, with clinical performance through the use of the Anesthesiology Performance Improved Reporting Exchange, the ASPIRE metrics. Dr. Huffmyer is an American Board of Anesthesiology Applied Examiner and also serves on the ABA's in-training examination and OSCE examination committees. She's a council member of the Association of Anesthesia Core Program Directors and also is an assistant editor for anesthesia and analgesia. Third up today is Dr. Sara Neves, who is the program director for the anesthesia residency program at Beth Deaconess Medical Center and Harvard Medical School in Boston, Massachusetts. She completed her anesthesiology training at the Yale New Haven Hospital and her fellowship in critical care medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital. She serves as vice chair for the Committee of Resident Education for the Society of Education and Anesthesia, also called SEAT, and is a member of the Committee on Occupational Health of the American Society of Anesthesiologists. Her interests are diverse and include resident feedback, curriculum development, wellness and substance abuse prevention, and the improvement of resident recruitment practices. Her clinical interests include anesthesia for complex vascular procedures, point-of-care ultrasound, and the management of patients on extracorporeal membrane oxygenation in the United States. She enjoys spending her free time with her husband and her 2 young daughters, who are very cute, by the way. Dr. Fei Chen is an assistant professor in the Department of Anesthesiology at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill and she'll be rounding out our panel today. She also serves as the co-director of the Academic Medicine rotation of the department and a member of the Leadership Council of the Academy of Educators at the UNC School of Medicine. Dr. Chen received her doctorate in educational psychology and methodology from the State University of New York in Albany. Her recent research work focuses on curriculum and instructional design for enhanced learning in medical education. Working with faculty and scholars within and outside of UNC, Dr. Chen has designed, implemented, and evaluated multiple research projects for curriculum improvement, simulation-based education, and clinical feedback and assessment. So she has a lot to contribute to this concept on cognitive theory of multimedia learning that supports educational changes in COVID. The questions will be addressed at the end by our panelists, and so we'll start the presentations now. Thank you for your attention.
Hi, I'm going to talk to you about active learning in a virtual setting. I have nothing to disclose. We're first going to talk about passive learning, and this is an example of a passive classroom. In a passive classroom, you have teacher-centered delivery of lectures where you pass on factual information that typically can be regurgitated back, and the goal is not necessarily for that information to be applied in new settings or to solve problems. And this is an active classroom. And active learning describes an approach to learning and not just a singular educational method. In active learning, you have the control shifts from the teacher to the learner, and the teacher takes on more of a role of a facilitator or a coach, and the students assume ownership of their education. The learners participate in the classroom and use higher order thinking to solve problems. And the goal is to increase knowledge retention and that the learners will be able to utilize that information to solve problems in new situations that they haven't seen before. There's a big focus on teamwork and collaboration. And the active learning area allows the teacher to see where there are knowledge gaps, and then the teacher can teach to them and address them in real time. Hopefully, active learning improves knowledge gain and knowledge retention. There has been some mix in the literature about this, but it's been proven to be at least as good as basic lectures. It also has this building sense of community and increased motivation for lifelong learning. This is a pyramid of which we've seen many, but the top of this pyramid shows what happens with passive learning and how much an adult learner retains 2 weeks after the learning event. And you'll see that with the passive learning, it's on the lower side, 10 to maybe 50% of passive learning is retained in 2 weeks, versus active learning, it's from about 70 to 90% that is retained after 2 weeks. And this includes things like participating in a discussion or giving a talk or doing the activity, solving the problem. And that's really what our goal is through active learning. Now, I fully realize that we are in a passive learning situation right now, and the hypocrisy sort of behind that. And unfortunately, we can't and probably shouldn't always use active learning, but I'd like to give you some tools so that you can implement active learning in some of your virtual teaching. And one way to do this is through audience response questions. And we've all used these both probably as a teacher and most definitely as a learner. And I'm going to talk with the virtual platform of Zoom because that's where my experience lies. But in a virtual platform like Zoom, you can use the animations or things like the thumbs up, the thumbs down, raise your hand, or things for people to participate that way, where the teacher can sort of get the scope of the group and just get a sense of what they're thinking. You can also use the polling function of Zoom, and I've used this a number of times. It's pretty easy to incorporate. It's basically utilized for like multiple choice questions. You can use other audience response systems while you're on a virtual platform. One example would be Poll Everywhere. And the benefit of doing this is it gives you more variety in what you can use for the audience response. So you can do multiple choice questions, you can do open-ended questions, you can do a word cloud like this. And the overall benefit of audience response is that everybody can participate, and it's anonymous as far as what the audience members say. So it leaves people a little bit less vulnerable, and it doesn't lead to only those sort of vocal folks really participating. So peer teaching is a concept that's technically the teacher and the learner are at the same educational level or level of training. More common, we do what's called near peer teaching, where the learner is taught by somebody with a little bit more experience than them, but not like to the degree of a faculty member. So some examples of this might be a senior resident teaching a junior resident, or a junior resident teaching a medical student. So the benefits of peer teaching include that you could shift some of the teaching burden away from the faculty who have a lot of time pressures. The teacher gets the experience of teaching and gets to master the information for themselves. Peers may be better equipped to put themselves in the position of a learner because they're closer to the experience, whereas we may have a hard time remembering like how much you knew at that stage in your training. And the teacher, by retrieving this information, it should help with their retention of the material as well. So you can utilize peer teaching in a number of ways. One of them is this think, pair, share, or think, group, share model. And you do this by, you put out a question to the entire group, and then you can break them up into pairs or small groups and have them answer the question and work together. And that's where the peer teaching comes in. And then you bring them back as a whole for them to share their answers with the whole group. And that peer teaching part, those small groups, you can do those in breakout rooms on a virtual platform. You can also use case-based learning or problem-based learning, in which most of us have experience with this. You give the small groups, break them into small groups again, and you give them a STEM or a problem to solve, and then you can give them more pieces of the puzzle as they go, and their job is to solve the problem or diagnose the patient. There's been minimal benefit to this versus regular traditional lectures as far as the evidence shows, but the learners do prefer it to a traditional lecture. Role play is another thing. I know a lot of people cringe when they hear this, but it's sort of a form of simulation. And the learner can either play themselves or can play a scripted scenario, somebody from a scripted scenario. This is often used for communication, interpersonal skills, or professionalism. One of the things that I've used it for would be for giving and receiving feedback. And again, you can break them into small groups and breakout rooms to utilize this in a virtual setting. So as we discussed, the breakout rooms can be put together ahead of time or sort of on the fly. And one of the great things about them is you as the teacher, the facilitator, can pop into the rooms to see how your students are doing and to answer any questions, to get a gauge on when it's time to bring them back to the whole group. Zoom also allows you to use whiteboards. So you can put up this whiteboard with a question or a problem on it, and your learners can write on there. They can answer the question on there. They can solve a problem on there. They can work together, and it's just another way to sort of engage. Along those same lines, you can put up a slide like this one where you ask them to annotate. So they can put a stamp or put like an X or something or their initials in the boxes of what they would use. This one is an example of which modes of active learning would you use going forward. Now, having said that, there are barriers to active learning, both in real in-person time and on a virtual platform. The learners sometimes fear that they may not cover all the material and might not be comfortable participating. And for the teachers, you may be unfamiliar with the techniques. Technology, especially now with Zoom, and it can be an unpredictable environment because you don't know what your students are going to ask you. So you have to be ready to say, I'm not sure about that one. We'll look it up and regroup. And it does take time to prepare, but I would also say it takes time to prepare a lecture too. And once you got it set, you can just sort of rework things. So all in all, I think that active learning should be utilized. It shouldn't be it should get up and regroup. And it does take time to prepare, but I would also say it takes time to prepare a lecture too. And once you've got it set, you can just sort of rework things. So all in all, I think that active learning should be utilized. It shouldn't be the only thing that we use, but it should sort of be a component of multimodal curriculum. Thank you.
Hi, I am Julie Huffmyer from the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. I'm happy to be here today to talk to you about adaptation of simulation practices in the time of COVID as part of this IARS SEA webinar regarding anesthesia education in the time of COVID. I have no financial relationships with commercial interests to disclose, and my presentation does not include discussion of off-label or investigational use products. As most of us are aware, simulation in anesthesiology residency training is standard and has become an annual ACGME requirement for accredited programs. Many of the benefits of the use of simulation during COVID are really no different than the benefits of simulation prior to the COVID pandemic. Simulation is well established as a method of improving communication and teamwork for use in difficult or challenging cases or in rare and uncommon crises. Specifically, during early COVID, in areas which had fewer cases or healthcare system burden, simulation contributed to a sense of increased patient and healthcare worker safety. Many programs, such as ours, pictured here, were able to rotate anesthesia residents, faculty, nurse anesthetists, and ICU doctors and nurses through the safe practice of care for COVID patients, including donning and doffing PPE, as well as intubation and central line insertion experiences. While we have all put on gown, gloves, hats, and masks most every day of our professional lives, we have not practiced how to do this safely without self-contamination during a pandemic. Debriefing is a key component for the success of simulation as an educational method. It allows exploration and understanding of team-related communication and dynamics, actions, processes, and outcomes. For example, after a simulated intubation sequence, team members were able to work together to give feedback and point out potential breaches and contamination that might lead to infection. Debriefing in multidisciplinary groups after early COVID experiences and actual patient care scenarios revealed pitfalls in communication and helped streamline processes and protocols that helped reduce the number of healthcare providers in the room, as well as demonstrated problems with PPE, the ability to obtain medications and equipment in isolated COVID ORs and ICU rooms, and helped us learn about safe patient transportation between units. While simulation was a quickly advanced and adapted process during COVID, there have been some significant challenges. For our institution, we had lots of demand for simulation practice during COVID, but physical distancing and requirements to reduce the number of people together at one time limited how many people we could rotate through the space. Other institutions that have had larger COVID numbers were so busy caring for sick patients, often in makeshift operating rooms and ICUs, that they didn't have time or opportunity to use simulation for training and education. Additionally, the use of standardized patients and high-fidelity simulation technicians increased the size of groups and potential early COVID exposures. Simulation in the traditional sense can be expensive. It requires time in a simulation center and supplies. It also requires trained personnel. In early COVID, we needed to save PPE for patient care, but we also needed PPE to truly practice safe donning and doffing. Often, simulation centers reuse supplies in order to conserve resources, and early on, we didn't know if there would be potential infection risk with reuse of supplies. COVID required some adaptations for the use of simulation education, some of which have been reviewed already. One of the interesting applications of simulation during COVID has become the rise of in situ simulation. This opportunity to provide simulation education in the actual environment where patient care is delivered limits that contrived feel of simulation, or the answer of, well, in real life, I would normally do this. In situ simulation also provides the opportunity to adapt training and education to a multidisciplinary group of doctors, nurses, and technicians. It is less expensive as it uses actual care delivery space, equipment, and the normally present healthcare teams. Another specific adaptation for simulation during COVID has been the recording of simulations and teaching sessions such that others can watch and even participate in via interactive technology like Zoom, and then debrief about the situation after the simulation. Our institution recently began to do more formalized in situ simulations on our obstetrics suite. This was spearheaded by one of our CA3s, Dr. Emery Myers, along with one of our OB anesthesiologists and simulation facilitators, Dr. Jessica Sheeran. Dr. Myers began this work during her COVID furlough weeks as a CA1 and finalized most of the scenarios during her education elective in the spring of 2021. The main goal for this in situ simulation is to promote teamwork of obstetricians, anesthesiologists, and labor and delivery nurses during obstetric emergencies. This team is conducting one emergency OB simulation quarterly. In order to enhance the educational session prior to the time of simulation, educational and reading material is sent out, and 5 different dates with different times of the day are available in order to give the off-shift and night float teams a chance to participate. The main debriefing session afterward tackles teamwork and the specific barriers to quality and safe patient care, as well as the medical and emergency management specific to the case. This is an example of one of the simulations that's being used this year. You can see that there's a fairly significant development process to these cases, and a lot of thought and planning goes into the in situ simulation. It's not just something that happens on the spur of the moment. The pre-session work and background reading is doable, and it's very short, and then all of the goals and objectives are used to keep the simulation on track. Finally, at the end of the in situ simulation, debriefing is vitally important to reiterate the lessons learned and potential areas for improvement going forward, including things like team dynamics, communications, and other processes. As a review question, which of the following advantages is noted as a result of debriefing after simulation educational experiences in the time of COVID? Increased communication among team members, increased speed and procedures, decreased risk of self-contamination, or decreased need for multidisciplinary team members. The answer is increased communication among team members. With the rationale listed here and the discussion during this talk, debriefing after simulation, whether it was during COVID or it's unrelated to an acute pandemic or challenge, is a core element of simulation education. It really helps to improve communication amongst team members and help folks work together better in the future. I'd like to thank you for your attention and the opportunity to speak with you today. I also want to make sure to thank our Simulation Center faculty and staff at UVA who helped make all of our COVID simulation education possible.
Hello, and welcome to my part of the webinar. I wanted to talk about learning management systems and the use of learning management systems during COVID. So in the next few minutes, we're going to review modern learning techniques and why you need a learning management system or an LMS. What is an LMS? What to look for in an LMS for your program, and the use of learning management systems during COVID. So the old paradigm, right, traditional learning is, you remember in residency getting that pile of books, maybe Barish or Miller and maybe Chestnut's OB Anesthesia. You would have lectures 2 or 3 times a week sitting in a hall with your co-residents. And knowledge assessment was maybe a couple times a year, your anesthesia knowledge test, your in-service training exam yearly, and then of course your written boards. While an advantage of this system is that you guarantee delivery of learning information, right? I know that my residents received a lecture on cardiac risk assessment or the difficult airway algorithm, but there's infrequent knowledge assessment. So I can't really tell if they've received any of that knowledge. There's little learner engagement. It's time consuming. So if I want to deliver more information, I have to find another hour for another lecture. Or time for them to read another chapter. And it's good for static knowledge, but not great for dynamic knowledge. And what do I mean by that? So static knowledge are, just the facts, ma'am, right? Immutable pieces of information, such as the brachial plexus anatomy or lung volumes, right? Things that don't change over time, great to find in a textbook. But we have a lot of dynamic knowledge. So things like technical skills or approach different techniques in some of our procedures, surgical approaches and the changing surgical landscape and how our anesthetics adapt to that. The development of clinical judgment is something that's quite dynamic. And then, of course, modern evidence, right, that comes up that can affect our anesthetics. So we find a multimodal or blended learning approach is something that can address these things. So this is something many of you are already doing, right? This incorporates not just traditional lectures, but also simulation, flipped classroom techniques and e-learning, problem-based learning discussions, skills sessions. There's increased learner engagement and satisfaction. It addresses both the static and dynamic knowledge here. It can incorporate institutional knowledge, right? So you have ways to address the specific needs of your learner for your program. And it supports both synchronous and asynchronous learning, right? Incorporating e-learning techniques means that you don't have to find an hour of time during the busy clinical time for your learners to participate in learning. How do we keep all that organized though, right? The sim case, the journal club articles, maybe post-test quizzes that you want to do. Well, the answer to that is a learning management system. So an LMS is software that stores, administers, documents, and tracks educational courses and training programs. So this is something that can be commercial, right? Lots of industries use LMS, academic programs, universities, and high schools use things like Blackboard. It can be homegrown. So we use a free program structure called Moodle, where we can build our own LMS. I'll show you an example of that in a minute. And it can use either existing or original content. So well, we have some very engaged faculty that like to create their own content for their different modules and things. And then we also use content off the Anesthesia Toolbox, which is a fantastic tool and LMS that you can tailor to your own needs as well. So advantages of an LMS is that it centralizes all this educational information. So not just the contents, right? The simulation case, the PBLD questions, but also the logistics, right? What's the schedule, right? where am I supposed to show up for my skills session? What are the quizzes that I need to complete? It facilitates these modern learning techniques, right? It keeps them all in one place, and it's easy for learners to figure out what they have to do and when. It allows tracking and documentation. So when I have a learner that's struggling, I can go in and see, okay, they're taking advantage of all the things that we are offering them in terms of content, and they're still struggling. So what's my approach here? Or they're not engaged with the content, and let me see what I can do to change that. And it's adaptable, right? So it can be changed not by having to make an entirely new PowerPoint and find an hour for that, but it can be by incorporating a new module or a new quiz or something to address changing needs of your program. This is an example of the LMS here at BIDMC. We use Moodle, so we built this ourselves. It doesn't have to be fancy or glossy. You can organize it by subspecialty. You can organize it by rotation or learning or learner level. You have a specific login here so that it keeps it specific to your program. And it's pretty easy to build. So what do you want to look for? You want to look for something that allows for course content creation. So something that is going to be adaptable and create the content that you want. You want to have something that uses that can offer skills testing. So where do I store pre and post test quizzes? Or other ways of assessing knowledge. It can include gamification, which is something that we know is important in learner engagement, right? Learners can get badges or bragging rights for completing different training modules. Video conferencing, of course, is something that we all hold very near and dear to our hearts. So this is a place an LMS can store all those Zoom links, or can create have its own specific platform that you can use for virtual learning. Social boards and forums is something that we use to increase learner engagement in an asynchronous manner. So it doesn't have to be someone raising their hand and talking during PBLD, but it can be someone working through an online PBLD at their own pace, right? And people post different answers or questions, responses to the case. Onboarding and compliance is a way to also help track which residents have done maybe pre-rotation work or those hospital required elements. And then on the back end for you, things like data tracking, reports, and analytics are going to be important, again, to look at how your learners are engaging with the content. Well, it can be expensive. There are startup and growing pains. You need to have learner buy-in. You need to be able to update the content. Some people have real trouble with technical skills. So, we thought maybe this is not for us. Before we really, before COVID, I thought maybe we just, I don't have time to deal with all this. And then COVID happened. So, as with many of you, we had the OR shutdown and, nothing happening for a few weeks. And that quickly led to the COVID surge, right? At least the first one. So from an education standpoint, I don't know if any of you know this from Twilight Zone, right? I thought, oh, there's time now. Everyone's sitting at home, just, waiting. The learners, have some time to breathe. They can just read or do something, for their own learning. And then we needed to pull them all into the ICU. So it just wasn't fair. We had time, and then it got immediately taken away. So what did we do? We tried to make some lemonade here. So COVID disrupted the learning environment, but necessity became the mother of invention for us. We needed to find a way to disseminate information, rapidly changing information, We needed to incorporate an asynchronous learning technique and virtual option, right, for residents that were in many different places and with many different schedules, and didn't really want to necessarily pull them all together at one time, either virtually or in person. We were trying to be adaptable. Learners were primed for a different approach, right? So instead of me coming with a wacky new idea for only online learning, right, it was, this is something that we need to do to address your learning in a time where learning is already disrupted. And then we had faculty with some time and ideas. So we found that, the take home points here were that blended learning offers a significant advantage over traditional didactics. We know that an LMS can facilitate blended learning. Want you to consider your program, look for user-friendly, easily modified, affordable system, and use the disruption during COVID in the usual order of business to try something new, and people are open for something different. So at this point, I will take any questions. Thank you so much.
Hello, I'm Fei Chen. Today I'm going to give a brief session on cognitive theory of multimedia learning and how to apply it to teaching. I'm an assistant professor from the University of North Carolina, and I have no disclosures. After the session, I hope you are all able to describe the theory, list its instructional goals, and apply its principles for instructional design. The cognitive theory of multimedia learning is a theory of how people learn from words and pictures. It is based on empirical studies guided by theories of learning science, including dual coding theory, cognitive load theory, and generative learning theory. The theory makes three assumptions about how the human mind works. First, the dual channel assumption, which believes that humans have separate systems for processing pictorial and verbal material. Second, limited capacity assumption, that each channel is limited in the amount of material that can be processed at one time, mostly because of the limited capacity of our working memory. As shown here, there are a lot of processing going on simultaneously. And third, active processing assumption, that meaningful learning involves cognitive processing, including building connections between pictorial and verbal representation, making linkage between the prior knowledge in the long-term memory and the new knowledge. Corresponding to the three assumptions, the theory also possesses three important instructional goals for online or virtual learning. First, instruction should be designed in a way to reduce extraneous processing. That is, to minimize distraction and eliminate aspects of a lesson that make the learner to engage in cognitive processing that does not serve an instructional purpose. For example, this figure may be eye-catching, but it makes the learner spend much more time and effort on irrelevant information processing than they need to. And here, a 3D pie chart may look fancier than a 2D pie chart, but the proportion of the 3D charts usually is distorted. So it's actually better to use a 2D chart or just a bar chart instead of these three figures to summarize the statistics visually. There are several design principles to follow to reduce extraneous processing, including the coherent principle, that is, eliminate unneeded material. Do not use the chart that I just showed you, is a good practice following this principle. And signaling principle, which highlights essential material. Redundancy principle, that is, do not add on-screen text to narrated graphics. Spatial contiguity principle, that is, to place on-screen text near corresponding graphics, and temporal contiguity principle, that is, to present corresponding speech and the graphics at the same time. Even when most extraneous processing is reduced, learners' cognitive system can still be overloaded if the learning material is too complex. Therefore, we also need to manage essential processing. which requires the instructor to scaffold the lesson in ways that ensure the learner can process the relevant material during learning. 3 major learning science principles apply to the management of essential processing in online learning here. First, segmenting. Break the lesson into meaningful parts or modules, say 5 minutes each, instead of narrating or playing a video of 30 minutes or an hour long. Pre-training principle, that is to introduce definitions of the key concepts and principles before the lesson that involves application of the knowledge. And a modality principle. If you are playing a video of a real case, simulation, or animation, just narrate the keywords or scripts rather than print the scripts on screen. The third goal of the instruction is to foster generative processing. For this goal, the instructional design should motivate the learner to exert efforts to understand the material. So active learning techniques that involve knowledge retrieval and generative processing are desirable. So in addition to using active learning techniques, here are 3 instructional design principles for fostering generative processing, mostly related to video-based asynchronous learning material design. First, personalization. Use conversational language involving you, we, and I, rather than formal language. Embodiment principle. If you are presenting live, try to have your camera on to show your face, like we do today. If you are making an instructional animation or video, try to include an on-screen character who uses human-like gesture and facial expression. And voice principle, that is, it is important to narrate in an appealing human voice rather than a machine synthesized voice. To summarize, meaningful learning occurs when people engage in appropriate cognitive processing during learning, including selecting the related material, organizing it into coherent structure, and integrating it with related knowledge activated from long-term memory. All right, lastly, a very quick review of the session. Today, we described what the cognitive theory of multimedia learning is about and its 3 assumptions here. We got to know the 3 instructional goals of the theory proposed for meaningful online learning and the principles to guide instructional design. I hope you enjoyed this presentation and find it useful in designing your own learning materials. And here are the key references that I do recommend you to read about if you're interested. And thank you for attending this session.
Wow, I want to thank all the speakers for outstanding presentations. These are really thought-provoking and excellent ways to motivate your learners in this new difficult world we find ourselves faced with. We can start taking questions now, and we'll start. Kristen, are there any questions that you have processed already?
We have 2 questions in the Q&A box if you click Q&A on your Zoom taskbar.
Perfect. Okay. All right. There's a question for Dr. Martinelli. Is there research on optimal time of day and duration outside of simulation to teach learners? Dr. Torres writes that in her clinical setting, we have drifted to early morning 6:15 conferences before the operating room begins. Now with virtual conferences, we even get to see where our learners are, usually setting up in the operating room environment as the conference progresses. These have become passive teaching experiences no matter who is teaching, whether it's a faculty or a fellow.
don't know of any research that shows when the best time is for our learners, especially that in medical education. I know for us specifically here at UNC, we don't have much of an option because of our OR obligations. And so we too do most of our didactics in the morning before ORs. And we've gotten some slack from the residents on that, that's not the best time to learn. But unfortunately, that works best for us to be able to get the most learners available for the didactics. As far as active versus passive, I hear you, and I think that what I try to do when I do the didactic sessions with the smaller groups of learners, so like our CA1 class for our basic board prep, I ask them all to turn their cameras on, and they may not do it, but I really encourage them to do it and encourage them to do it throughout. I also tell them before we start, like the night, the day, well, actually, I try to set something out like the week before for them to watch. And then again, reiterate that my expectation for them is that they watch the video ahead of time and that they participate. It's not just going to be me talking. It's not just going to be a lecture. And and if they don't, then I call on them, which they may not appreciate, but I do have them come up to me afterwards and say, it's really hard, I know, for folks to participate, but we appreciate when you bring us in, and don't tell my friends that I said that, but I think I learn better with that. And so I think in those small groups, it certainly is harder than if you have them sitting in a room together, because there are so many more distractions. Like you said, they're all still setting up their ORs. But in those small groups, I think if you give them the heads up that the expectation is that they participate, and then make it an interactive session, that they may help with the active component. It does not help you with the timing at all. I don't know if any of my colleagues have any thoughts on that, but I don't know of any literature for that.
I think everybody biorhythmically is going to have a different time that's their ideal time of day. Some people are just naturally morning people versus other times of day. Certainly there's literature about exercise and also some about learning, but it's going to be very difficult to find a time that works ideally for everybody clinically and from a cognitive perspective. Any other panelists have any thoughts on that? Okay, we'll move on to the second question by Dr. Miara from Northwell Health in New York. I believe this is for Dr. Martinelli. It says, thanks for a great presentation. We agree overall active learning provides more benefits versus passive learning. Do you think that in some opportunities or exceptions, passive learning can be superior to active learning? And then which ones and why?
I do think there's a time and a place for it. I'm a big proponent of active learning. I think it's more fun to teach that way. And I think I hope, I guess, there's better retention because the data is mixed. But as Dr. Neves was saying, I think we need a multimodal approach to education. And so there is a time and a place for a basic lecture and for passive learning. For me personally, the bigger the group, the harder it is to engage in everybody. Certainly the virtual platforms make it harder, although it still can be done. I think for lectures where like this, I mean, I don't know how we could have possibly made this an interactive experience. It would have been super fun to meet you all and to see your faces, but I don't know how you could do it with a pre-recorded for our talks and then not even be able to see who you are and where you are and how many of you there are out there. So this is a place where I think passive learning probably is most appropriate. When I do like visiting grand rounds, I love to try to get some active learning methods in, but it's different than if it's like a small group with the residents where I use more of a flipped classroom method where I have expectations that they prepare ahead of time. So I think you have to take that into account as well. But not everybody is gonna like this. And certainly from a personal perspective, there's times where I like to just sit and take it all in as well. So I don't know, that maybe doesn't answer your question fully, but I think there's a time and a place for all components of learning, passive and active. If you can incorporate a little bit of active learning in any of your sessions, I think you will engage and bring back your learners throughout. So if you can just throw out some audience response questions periodically, I think you're going to bring back your group a little bit. But I don't think it's something that should be used in the entirety of the session every single time. But I do love it. Big fan.
Any of the other panelists, Dr. Huffmyer, Dr. Neves, Dr. Chen, have any comments on that?
Yeah, I can speak to it. I think it also sort of answers the next question. They sort of blend into each other. I think making sure that the learner experience is standardized, or that they're getting the information. You're making sure that they're having a comprehensive education means that some of that passive learning has to be a piece, right? Whether the passive learning is them getting through certain chapters of more standardized or comprehensive textbooks, but that doesn't mean that that can't also be a part of a multimodal process or an active learning process, right? So they're getting some of that passive learning piece, right? Not, I think, especially in anesthesiology, it feels like not everything can be experiential, right? Sometimes they have to just learn what the inhaled anesthetics are. So I think that's where the role of passive learning fits in, but it can certainly be the precursor to some more active learning techniques.
I just wanted to add, has nothing to do with simulation really, but some of the work we have done at UVA in generative retrieval, and that's looked at generative retrieval, we tried to extend that to various and sundry different things. We start out with echocardiography. We try to do it with things like ultrasound-based regional anesthesia and so on. And it works for some things, but it doesn't work for everything. And so I think that that's just another example of how it takes many different modes, right, to have a well-rounded training and education program. And that's all I wanted to add about that.
Thank
Yeah, I echo all these points, and I think nowadays, most of our roles may, start to change because of the less predictable schedules in COVID and maybe even post-COVID, and when more people are adopting like virtual learning and hybrid learning settings. And I think one thing that I see is becoming a trend is that there are more and more LMS and asynchronous learning and teaching that is happening. And I think this trend will continue regardless whether, we overcome, whether there will be a post-COVID era. And to adapt to such change and in paradigm, I think medical educators may also consider, the scope of their work and how they tackle, the contents of learning and the way of, conveying knowledge. As Sara, showcased that there are so many ways that we can, use blended learning approach that for maybe, I'm just making this up, but maybe for most of the synchronous learning opportunities, it's better to just use them to do case studies, to do, generative retrieval activities that really we can see the active learning process, that the learners are linking what they've already learned, right, via flipped classroom approach or some other things, and utilize and apply these learned knowledges in real case, or using active learning strategies. So I think this is a really good question, and it's kind of like linking all the four talks that we just had all together.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. So there was a second question that Dr. Miara had for Dr. Neves, but I believe, Sarah, did you already have a chance to answer that to your satisfaction? Okay, so that question for the audience was comparing LMS with more formal literature. And since LMS is currently evolving and not completely standardized, how can we make sure trainees use LMS as a reliable learning platform? And I think the speakers responded to that by, reminding us that we're going to have to integrate it in the context of other learning opportunities and other learning materials.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, Jen. It is certainly just about a multimodal approach. So there is definitely a role still for the traditional textbooks and even traditional lectures as a part of the larger piece, and using the LMS to help organize those pieces.
Well, very well put. Thank you, Dr. Neves. So Dr. Jones has a question about that I think is also for you. Any tips on engaging more faculty in the use of LMS in or the anesthesia toolbox?
Yeah, I think this is something that we struggled with for a while and continue to sort of work on, but I was surprisingly impressed with the effect that the sort of natural experiment of COVID on education had on learners and faculty alike to try something new. So, we always hesitate, inertia or status quo is really difficult to disrupt on a normal day-to-day basis and takes a lot of energy. But when it was basically already disrupted and everything fell to pieces, then it was surprisingly easy to have a bit of openness on, everyone is getting, building their technical skills, right? Learning how to use Zoom. It's another link, another website that they can click around on and get familiar with. So I think it was that readiness mindset that that our faculty had that helped with engagement with our LMS, and we're trying to keep that momentum up. We also designated sort of education champions within the different divisions. So it was more delegation of work and getting them to engage more with the platform. And so certain faculty really got into it, and then we're able to share that skills knowledge with some of the faculty who are still kind of getting familiar.
Excellent. There is a question for Dr. Chen. Can you elaborate on one of the instructional goals of CTML, specifically examples of reducing extraneous processing?
Sure, thank you. So as I mentioned that this theory is based on a lot of learning science theory. One of it is the cognitive load theory. And I think many of us here may have heard about this. It's basically saying that although it's important to make your talk fun and your learning materials to be interesting, and hopefully all the time, right? Like to keep our learners interested in this. But we are very limited in our ability to process materials, especially those new knowledge that involves very complex concepts or procedures. So it is recommended that you use something, some techniques to, like icebreaker or anything, like to engage them and to catch their attention from time to time. But when it's the turn of teaching the most important concept, principles, or and the theories, then it's better to reduce any irrelevant external processing, as much as possible. Like to achieve that goal, just imagine, the images that I showed, right? They are eye-catching, or there are some like really funny pictures that you can use in your slides, but they are not relevant. People may laugh at it and enjoy their time, but they may need a couple of more seconds to redirect their attention to what is most important from learning's perspective. And also, like, we want to cater learners of different mode. So sometimes some of us will be, more inclined to print a lot of our narratives on the screen while, talking about the same teaching points. So we thought that this may, cater to different types of like a visual learner and those who enjoy listening. But these actually, according to the multimedia theory, the cognitive processing actually can be competing with each other. Where you are looking at the, the total. So it is recommended that you only highlight the most important parts visually or verbally. Like it's not that both, but either or. And another example, like using the spatial contiguity example, is that I don't know if it happens a lot in our teaching, but sometimes, like if you are doing math or physics, like the lecture can have like 10 pages of slides, and from time to time, in order to explain a new concept, they will go back to previous slides or something to say, oh, I just showed you this, and now I'm going to talk this second point. Do you still remember the first one? And then they will scroll down to the previous one. And according to the multimedia learning theory, maybe it's better to remind learners on the same slides instead of scrolling back and back and forth. So that using the spatial contiguity to save unnecessary waste of cognitive load and processing efforts. So this is just a very rough, some very general ideas following these design principles. But when you're working on the design of specific materials and teaching materials, for example, like videos to be used in LMS, and there are a lot of detailed things that we can talk about when we are designing it. I hope that helps.
Oh, excellent. I think that was very comprehensive answer. Dr. Chowdhury asks, this is a panel question, question in general for the panel. She starts by saying she took so many notes, thank you. So that's great for our distinguished panel to know that she was using multiple channels there. For those of us who teach in rotating residence with limited staff, what are good resources to build teaching tools and presentations and other teaching resources? Colleagues don't have much time to make presentations, and they also need help updating teaching modalities. Some talks are decades old. Who would like to take that?
I can start off. I know, we'll start off with a shameless plug for the Anesthesia Toolbox, because it's certainly one way to have a lot of information to start off from. It's a really great tool. They have not just lectures and PowerPoints, but also problem-based learning discussions and some of the newer active learning modalities that we've talked about today. I think another technique that worked well for us is using trainees who may not have a scholarly activity or scholarly project, and assigned them either a faculty member to work on or something to sort of update or create a new, either a simulation case or a new talk on a topic. We have a specific education elective, but I think even outside of that, it is not too much work for a resident to do as their project on a more extended basis over some time, and can get them engaged in the topic as well.
I totally agree that Anesthesia Toolbox is an amazing resource for that, to get folks started. Another thing, especially if you're planning to use like a book classroom approach, which again I think is fantastic, would be you can get some of those videos on YouTube or online or from colleagues from another institution. The only thing is if you're using something like that, you need to vet it and make sure the information is correct and that the speaker is okay before you send it to your learners. But then, like when you get into the classroom, you can take questions from the old ACE exams, or from, again, the Anesthesia Toolbox, or other sort of platforms for multiple choice questions. You can use cases that you've experienced. So you can encourage your faculty, if they've had like a great case that happened in the OR, just have them jot notes down about it, and they can use that for teaching purposes to prove some points and adjust it as needed. So that may be a good starting point. The other thing is you can partner with some other institutions. There's no reason that we all need to be inventing all this information. We can share it, which again goes back to Dr. Neves' point of the Anesthesia Toolbox, but certainly we can collaborate beyond that as well.
Excellent. There's a couple more questions, and we only have 2 minutes left. Dr. Williams asks, do you plan a pre-test and post-test for all simulation learning sessions? Dr. Huffmyer?
Yeah, so that is variable. It probably makes a great deal of sense to prime kind of the learner, obviously beforehand, and then to kind of do some post simulation reiteration and so forth. In the in situ simulation, it's been a little bit more challenging to get different disciplines, if you will, to participate in some of those things, but there is definitely preparation work that's sent out, and a post evaluation, and also a post kind of a test or a reminder of the key points.
Sounds excellent. We're down to the last minute here. Dr. Torres asks for Dr. Neves, wanting to know what typical time dedicated to establish a learning management system, usual barriers, and how often does it get reviewed by a committee for updating and improvement. Also loved your classic Twilight Zone episode. I did too. That's one of my favorites. Burgess Meredith was impeccable on that.
I think, you know, in an ideal world, and certainly for industry or maybe for university academics, you know, there probably is a very coordinated onboarding and launch of an LMS that's, you know, fully loaded with content. I think one of the things that helped us in sort of transitioning or using our LMS is to recognize that it's going to be a gradual process. So ours has probably been in the works in some form for several years, right? A few years, and at, you know, the beginning there's not that much on it, or one subspecialty rotation used it more heavily than others, and so sort of being a bit forgiving of ourselves in terms of building it up gradually and recognizing that you're not going to have all the content at once, but at least you're starting to incorporate it, can be helpful and can help you overcome that barrier of feeling like you need to have a glossy, complete product all at once. Similarly with updating, I think we again delegate to the specific groups or divisions that are contributing the content there. We like to keep an overall sense of the you know, our one of our APDs for didactics keeps a more global view, right, of everything that's included, and that happens sort of on a continuous, you know, probably annual basis. But the nitty gritty, yeah, I don't think there's as much of a formal thing. I think the idea is to just try some things out and get started, not be too intimidated with not having something complete upfront.
Excellent. I completely agree. Kristen, there's one more question that came in from the chat. Is there time for us to answer that, or should we bid adieu?
Sure, you can do one more.
Okay, great. Dr. Deitchen asks, does anyone on the panel use Kahoot or similar to practice questions and encourage interactivity? Anybody have thoughts on that?
I have not personally used Kahoot, but I have some colleagues who have and love it. I don't know if they've transitioned it into the virtual format or just used it in person, but they said that it's great to produce a little bit of competition amongst the learners. But I don't personally have experience with it. I don't know if others have.
I've used it live, and it's been quite fun. I'm kind of competitive, and if you have prizes, I'll fight to the death for them. But I have not integrated it yet into my virtual learning. Anyone else on the panel?
No, I would agree. I haven't used it personally, but there was I remember that highly coveted 3D printout of a heart
Right?
model that was.
Yeah, I was like slamming my little remote trying to get that prize.
Yeah.
I think that's all the questions. I just wanted to thank the audience for asking excellent questions. I had jotted some down in case we were short on questions, but the audience covered all of my questions and more. I want to thank our distinguished panelists, Dr. Martinelli, Dr. Neves, Dr. Huffmyer, and Dr. Chen. Really phenomenal to hear your thoughts on this really challenging topic. I think you've inspired all of us to go back and help our learners to get through this wonderfully strange new world that we're in. So thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks, IRS.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you.
To our sponsors, the IRS and the Society for Education Anesthesia as well. I hope everybody has a great afternoon.